Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Facebook Live session from Oxford University Press. And today we're going to be talking about assessing teenagers online. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I've got a whole list of questions here that everyone sent through. We're looking forward to discussing those with you today. My name's Sarah Rogerson. I'm the Director of Assessment at OUP. While I'm introducing myself, if you could let me and Paul know you're here, write your name, write where you're from in the chat box. Be delighted to see you. So I'm sat here in Oxfordshire. It's a beautiful sunny day. Let me tell you a bit about myself. I've been working in ELT and assessment since last century. I've been working at OUP as the Director of Assessment for a couple of years. Before that, I worked at Cambridge Assessment. And way back when, I used to teach young learners English in Taiwan, where I stayed for 7 years and had a fantastic time. So if I can just hand over to Paul to introduce himself, please write in the box and let us know you're here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Paul Davis, and I'm a full-time writer of ELT coursebooks. I've been doing that for about 20 years now. Before that, I worked in publishing. I worked at Oxford University Press for 5 years. And before that, a long time ago now, I was a teacher in Spain and after that in the UK. My first writing job basically was writing some tests for somebody else's OUP course. And ever since then, I've been writing tests really as part of my job. And we're going to talk quite a lot later about the fact that writing tests, about how assessment is very much part of the learning process. It's also in a way part of the writing process, because I find if I'm trying to write a test and I'm really struggling to come up with questions and the test is about a particular unit, it could be that unit isn't quite right, because if I'm struggling to come up with questions, then maybe the target language isn't clear enough, or maybe it's not transferable enough, not useful enough. So writing assessments can be a really integral part of the whole writing process. And I'm interested to know how many of you write your own tests for your students, or whether you tend to use things that are available online or supplied by the publishers. So if you could just drop a comment about that into the comment box, that would be really useful. It would also reassure us that somebody is in fact out there watching this.
There are lots of people out there. I'm just looking at the comments box now. I feel like we've got representation from the whole world, including somebody, Paul, who says they're in love with you. So that's a good start to the session.
It's an excellent start.
And we've got the Philippines, we've got Latvia, Ecuador, Ukraine, Romania, Belgium, Honduras, Azerbaijan, Brazil. Lots of countries represented here today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. So if you could let us know if you do write your own test materials in the chat box while we're just waiting for everybody to sign on, that would be great. So we've got somebody, we've got Antonia from Italy who writes her own tests. I want somebody in from Northern Ireland. It's very exotic, Peter. Okay, so there's lots of people that have started to join at the moment, and indeed, Paul, a few people who do create their own assessments. So we've got some real assessment experts with us today, which is really good.
Great.
So now that we're starting to see a lot of people joining the session, I suggest we start talking through some of the questions, and I think this talk should really be called Cheating in Tests Online, because we've had so many questions from you all about cheating. So it's quite obvious that lots of people are really, really concerned about cheating. Lots of people, when they're thinking about giving people tests online, are worried that their students are going to cheat, worried that they're going to plagiarize, looking for tools to prevent cheating. I wonder, Paul, what would your tips be for cheating? What would you say about cheating?
Well, I think before I say that, it'd be interesting to know, just to ask people what they think. Why do they think cheating is bad? Why is it a problem? And also, just as a secondary question, do you think your students also think it's bad? Or is there actually a bit of a divergence of opinion between you and your students? Because I've seen some research saying that today's students really kind of think of cheating as part of the game. And most teachers, of course, don't look at it like that. I think in terms of tips for combating cheating, dealing with cheating, there are two sort of basic angles you can take on it. You could, there's a bit of a cliche, isn't there, with police dramas where you have a good cop and a nasty cop, nice cop, nasty cop. And in a way, you can look at cheating in the same way. So the nice cop, when it comes to cheating, is the one who makes students not want to cheat. So you're looking at students' engagement in the learning process, their motivation, things like that. And then the nasty cop is also part of the picture, and that's comes down to making cheating more difficult. So the two angles are, we want the students to be less keen to cheat. We want them to not want to cheat. But at the same time, we want to make it harder to cheat. So I think those are the two angles that we're going to take. And we've got quite a lot to say about both of those, haven't we, Sarah?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Just looking in the comments box now so we can see what people are saying about this. So Maria's saying students know it's bad, but they do it anyways. And I think it's a great point that you made, Paul, about it's almost like, do students see it as bad, or are they just using the technology that's available to them? And I think that's a big question for us to probably not answer in this session. But and we've also got some. So Irene is saying the problem is that students need some critical questions that cannot be answered with a copy paste answer from Google. So it's obvious that people are copy pasting.
Yeah.
And Charak is saying when you know your students well enough, you're able to predict what they would get right or wrong. Yeah. And Natalia has got a really great comment saying her students think it's a kind of creativity. And I've worked in assessment for so long. I've seen lots of different kinds of cheating, and I mean, sometimes the creativity is quite genius, actually.
Yeah.
But I suppose if we take your first point, making students less likely to cheat, how would you make students less likely to cheat, Paul?
Well, I think there are several aspects to this, but one that I think is central is, if you think of yourself as an adult learner, say if I decided I wanted to learn Polish, and I signed up for a Polish course which involved assessments, there's no way that I would cheat on those assessments, because that would completely undermine what I had set out to do. Of course, the situation for teenagers is different. But really what you need to do ultimately is to get your teenage students to think of themselves as independent learners, more like adult learners. So you're trying to get them to buy into that whole process of using assessments to help their learning, rather than seeing it as a game of cat and mouse where they're trying to evade someone, who's trying to catch them. Of course, that's easier said than done. So we need some concrete ideas for how to sort of achieve that. And I think the first thing we could talk about is what's sometimes called honor codes, where you talk about this issue explicitly with the students and you ask them to basically sign some kind of declaration saying that they are not going to cheat in tests, that the assessments they do are all going to be an accurate reflection of their knowledge. Now, you might say, if they're going to cheat, they can just sign it and then cheat anyway. But I think there is some evidence that this kind of thing can be effective, particularly if you remind the students before each assessment that they have signed this honor code, and of course remind them that being honest in their assessments is better for their own learning process. I'm just interested whether any of you have used honor codes, or have you thought about using them? Have you had good or bad experiences of using honor codes at all, or something similar?
I've read some interesting, while we give people a chance to respond, I've read some interesting research on honor codes, which shows that just the act of actually signing it makes people think twice about cheating. It does act as a deterrent to cheating in a lot of situations. And I think, Miria's just put a really valuable comment there in the chat, saying it's a great deal to convince a teen to not cheat, but it's not impossible. And I think that's really important. It's not impossible. And what Miria's talking about there is that lifelong learner that you're talking about, Paul, about reflecting, giving clear instructions and roles, and promoting values and ethics. So convincing people not to cheat is really important. And Maria's also saying most of the time honor codes do work. So I'd encourage people, if they are concerned about cheating, to look into honor codes a bit more. There's a lot of information available online. You could read about it. I think for me, when it comes to cheating, I think people will be more likely to cheat probably the higher stakes it is. So you mentioned if you were learning Polish, what our Brazilian and Portuguese friends who are online today will be happy to know that I'm learning Portuguese at the moment, and my kids are as well. And like you said, I wouldn't dream of cheating, but then I'm an adult, and also I'm not really having very important tests. We're just having a chat, and it's not that high stakes. So I think that for our friends online today, as relaxed and informal as you can make the assessment events, the better to avoid cheating. And go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right. The more stressed they get about the tests, and the more importance you attach to each assessment, the more nervous they're going to get. Now, obviously, if it's some kind of entrance exam for university or some sort of national test or preparation for that, there's not much you can do about that. But because there is some sort of consequence. But I think in the sort of day-to-day run-of-the-mill sort of teaching situation, you can decide to have more, to have smaller tests more often rather than a big test every term, and you can do things to actually reduce the amount of stress and anxiety. And I think the other advantage of having smaller tests more regularly is that the students are more likely to see them as part of the learning process, because they can see a very close relationship between what they've just been studying and this kind of mini assessment that you're doing in order to cement that knowledge. And it no longer becomes this kind of high stakes game where they're tempted to cheat. So that's one possibility, certainly.
Yeah. And I think there's some really great points, and it's coming through in the chat box as well with Jose, who's just saying that what he does is it indicates that cheating's not worth it because it doesn't allow us to become a better version of ourselves. And I think that's a really important comment, because we have to almost take a step back and think about what assessment is and what assessment isn't. And somebody's written that marks aren't important to them, and that kind of defines what assessment is, because for you as teachers, assessment is most often a way that you can get evidence to see how your students are doing so you can drive learning forwards. And in that case, cheating, as Jose is saying, that the students are just cheating themselves because their learning journey is going to be interrupted there. But how about, Paul, if we look at what can you actually do to stop people cheating? The second point of your one of your points. What would you say there?
Well, I would say that nothing is going to be 100% foolproof. I have 3 teenage children. I asked them this exact question: how can you stop teenagers cheating? And they said, you can't. We will always find a way. And I think that's partly the kind of arrogance of youth. But it's certainly true that if they put their minds to it, they will always find some way of evading whatever system you put in place. But you can certainly do things which make cheating a lot more difficult. And if you do that, then the incentive to cheat is reduced. If you have to, basically, teenagers are lazy. They're not going to want to work too hard in order to cheat. So if you make cheating as difficult as possible, there's a fair chance they won't do it as much. Some of the answer is technological, isn't it? Because you can have online platforms for testing, which, for example, jumble the question order or jumble the order of the options. That makes it much harder for them to have their mobile phone open next to the computer and share answers in a group chat if they're all doing the questions at a different time. I think also there's something, particularly if you're writing your own tests, you can do things related to the nature of the questions to make them more personalized or more open. You can still use it to test the same knowledge, but you can make sure that it's not as easy for them to just copy the answers between each other. So, for example, you might have a very basic vocabulary question where you're asking them to translate various words for activities. That's quite an easy one to cheat on. If you wanted to make it a little bit less easy, you could ask them, for example, the question could be, name 3 activities you can do at the beach and 1 that you can't do at the beach. You're still asking them to come out with the same vocabulary, but it's just harder for them to share the answers. It's going to be more obvious if they're just copying each other.
There are also a number of plagiarism tools that people could look at. I used to teach further education in a college in the UK about, oh gosh, 12, 15 years ago now. And I remember I got one assignment in from somebody that was obviously not their own work, let's say. And I just copied and pasted it into Google, and it came up immediately as a source text for something else in Google. So I think lots of plagiarism tools and different technology that people could use to identify cheating when it's happened.
Yeah, I think another option, because of course it's much harder. It's much harder to cheat, almost impossible to cheat in a sort of face-to-face oral exam. Is to sort of use that as a way of moderating the written exam. So they do the paper in writing, but you then ask sort of questions which are basically aimed at eliciting the same knowledge orally. And if they do particularly well on the written paper, but appear to know nothing when you talk to them face to face, then that should certainly set some alarm bells ringing. And if they know that that's the format and that they're going to have to perform face to face as well, then possibly that's a disincentive to cheating on the written paper. But I'm also interested that, because there must be situations where somebody does a written paper and they get 29 out of 30, and you think, well, that really doesn't tally with my experience of them when I'm teaching or when I have face-to-face conversations. What do you do in a situation where clearly there has been some fairly extreme plagiarism? What's your reaction to that? Is there a follow-up, or is there really nothing you can do about that? There must be all sorts of. It must depend on your teaching situation and all sorts of things. But it'd be interesting to know what normally happens in a situation where someone is either caught red-handed cheating, or maybe more problematically, isn't caught cheating, but you have very strong suspicions.
I think it'd be good to get some answers on that question about what you do when you found out that people are cheating. Maria's saying, how do you prove that they've cheated without having enough evidence? And in the writing, Maria, I think that is looking at some of the plagiarism tools that we've spoken about. It's also about just knowing your students well and knowing what they're capable of. And I think you can make a fair guess sometimes. I'm just looking at Laura's comment too. And she's saying that her daughter's attending school in Ireland, and because the tests are less stressed, less pressurized, people don't cheat as much. And that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning: make the test as low stakes as possible. So are there any answers that people have? As if you have a student and you found out they've cheated, what do? Do you confront them directly about it? Do you not mark their work? I remember in my example that I gave you in teaching in further education, I sat down and had a quite difficult conversation with the student who had physical evidence. There's some more good comments coming through. Lucina saying it's not the teacher's job to prove that somebody's cheated, it's the student's job to prove they know. And I think that's a fair point, but the amount of questions that we have about cheating indicates that there's a lot of interest in this.
Yeah, I wonder also that the one slightly different way of looking at another angle to look at it from would be, and I don't know if anyone has tried this, but in a written assignment, for example, to say, okay, use whatever technology you need to use. If you want to use Google Translate for this, that's fine. But I will expect the quality of the work to reflect the fact that you have used all these technological aids, and I'll grade it accordingly. And if everyone has the green light to do that, and the advantage of that, of course, is that as soon as they get beyond the education system, that's exactly what they're going to be doing when they're at work or in other walks of life when they have to use English. They will use whatever technology they have, because why not? So in that sense, it is a sort of authentic task to say to them, yes, use Google Translate and see how good a piece of work you can produce like that. because it still won't be perfect, and you'll still be able to grade it with that in mind.
And I think that's a good way to fit into a kind of a learning process as well, though, Paul, because you have got technology available and it is real life to use that. I just wondered if you could start by asking people for their own work and then give them some feedback, and then say, right, for the second version, you can go away and use some tools, and then you can see
Yeah.
the gap between that, between what the student can and can't do. Just quickly looking at the comment box, I know that somebody said, Charak said, if it's cheated, you shouldn't mark it. And Miria said, we have to take in consideration that learning's a process. And I really love this comment because I fundamentally believe this. Projects, activities, tests, and games are useful to see if they're learning. And in my opinion, Miria, all of those can be assessments as well. You get in data on how a student's performing, so you can change what you're doing in class, because that's really why you're using the assessment most of the time in the classroom. And Gabby is saying that the way that they deal with it is to get the student to present orally their composition. Sounds like a really great idea. Irene's asking students to redo it and ask follow-up questions. And obviously, if it's plagiarizing tools, it's difficult. If it's translation tools, you can't run them through plagiarizers. And Ozeas says tests should be named after another nomenclature. I don't think I pronounced that right. Tests scare students. My students panic when they hear test. I mean, you're the person, me, who's presenting right now. I failed my driving test 10 times. It's the only test that's ever made me panic. I finally passed last year after over 25 years of trying. I'm not ashamed of that. It's a tests scare some people, and I think that's what we're trying to do a little bit, is to take the fear out of it. And a lot of what we do at OUP in terms of some of our tests, like the Oxford Test of English, is we've taken out all the tricky task types that really people have to prepare for, and we're trying to just focus on what you know, and that's why it's adaptive as well, because we can focus on what you know and what you don't know. So I think, yeah, let's make tests as friendly as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really a really nice comment, actually, about calling them something other than tests, calling them, a progress check or a consolidation exercise or something like that. And, because I think ultimately, as we started off by saying, the easiest way to tackle cheating is to get the students to see assessment as part of the learning process. And, that's not a quick fix. It's something that you kind of need to work on over time, isn't it? With the way you use assessment over the course of the terms and the years. But that must be the ultimate goal. And I think for the course that I've spent most time working on over the last few years is solutions. And I know that in solutions, one of the downloadable extras is a vocabulary testing sheet. And this is something where the students basically write translations of the words, and they test themselves using this sheet. And it's nothing that involves the teacher at any stage beyond giving them this piece of paper at the beginning, but it's helping them to see, because it's called a vocabulary self-test, that this kind of self-assessment is part of the learning process. And if it's something they do regularly, they're much more likely to really buy into that mindset, I think.
Definitely. Just checking in on the comment box as well, because there's a lot of really good comments coming through there. But you've just mentioned self-assessment, and we've had a few questions come through about self-assessment. So I thought it might be a good time to look at those. So we've got Lasma from Latvia asking how students can assess themselves online. And we've got Jose from Colombia saying, how can we involve our students even more into self-assessment of their learning process, and what tools or strategies can we use for it? And I was just going to speak for a few seconds on self-assessment, really, because I think it's something that most teachers know of, but it's not always the easiest thing to do. So if you do self-assessment successfully, and that's part of your teaching offer, please tell us about it in the chat box while I kind of talk through some of my thoughts on self-assessment. So self-assessment is really helping create that lifelong learner that we spoke about in, how to stop people from cheating, really. Self-assessment is really important. And I think for me, the three most important things to think about when it comes to need a really clear assessment criteria. And for any kind of assessment, no matter what the stakes, students need to know what they're being tested on. It's unfair otherwise. Even if you're playing a game or you're doing any kind of activity, students need to know what you're looking for. So I would say in self-assessment, number one is you need really clear criteria so the student knows what you're expecting of them. I'd say number two, you want to show them an example of what good looks like. This is often overlooked, I think, in a lot of ELT is what good looks like. It's really important for students to know what they're aiming for. And then the third thing is to have really clearly well-written tasks that are focused on what you actually want the student to output. So my 3 tips for self-assessment are have a clear kind of guide, a clear framework, clear criteria actually, show students what good looks like, and have well-designed tasks. And then they should be able to go away and complete the task and assess themselves. If you want to know more about self-assessment, I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to pop a link in the box right now, but the Common European Framework for Reference, the CFR, has some really useful self-assessment grids that cover all the skills, all the levels that you can use with your students so that they can then go away and assess themselves using whatever tasks you want to give them. So if one of my colleagues could put the CFR, there you go, if you can see that in the box right there, if you use that grid, then that should be something that could help you with self-assessment. Paul, is there anything else you want to add on self-assessment?
Well, the only thing I'd like to add is that I think another sort of form of self-assessment is linked to these kind of apps, mobile apps you can get. So this is a less formal kind of assessment, but things like Quizlet or Kahoot, it's quite fun for teenagers to try and beat their own score on various tests. I don't think there's any harm in doing the same quizzes more than once, because that again is, it's part of the learning process, isn't it? But certainly that sort of competing against yourself is a sort of less formal kind of self-assessment, which can be quite appealing, certainly. And
just checking in on the comment box, Hua Li, I hope I'm pronouncing that. I'm sorry if I'm not. Saying it takes a lot of time, self-assessment. And I think it can take a lot of time to get it set up and make it part of the routine. But probably the value you get from it is worth that time in the long term. I mean, Letitia's saying at the school she works in, they've been doing self-assessment for 3 years, and it's great to make them analyze their behavior. It is a long-term culture. And I think that's what we're talking about in all of this so far. It's a bit of a culture change just to stop people from wanting to cheat, to look at new ways of assessing. And self-assessment could really be a winner for you if you've got the time and energy to invest in the short term. But definitely check out the self-assessment grids, because there's a mine of information there. So, Paul, we've had a question on ideas on assessing students' oral fluency. Could you tell people what some tips on assessing oral fluency?
Yes, I think so I think one of the most important things, well, there are various things that are important, but one of the most important things if you're assessing oral fluency is to make sure you have some kind of criteria, some fixed criteria for assessment. And really, if what you're assessing is oral fluency, the most important of those criteria has to be linked to how well they communicate. So for example, if you want to end up with a mark out of 20 for your oral assessment, you might allocate 14 marks, for example, specifically for how well they've answered the questions or how well they've explained themselves in their presentation, or whatever it is. Now, you might also want to allocate some marks for other aspects. So you might allocate a few marks for range of grammar and vocabulary, for example. You might even want to allocate a couple of marks for pronunciation, if that's something that you think you should allocate marks for. That's a bit of a personal preference amongst teachers, but the bulk of the marks have to be linked to communication if that's what you're assessing. So that's a sort of formal marking grid, I suppose, if you're doing a fairly formal assessment. There are other things you can do if you want to assess more quickly and less formally. So one idea, for example, would be to have something called a conversation ladder. So what a conversation ladder would be is a list of, say, 8 questions that you are going to ask the student. So that's the form of the assessment, is an interview, face-to-face interview, online interview with the student. And the questions get more difficult. So the first question would be something really easy, like, what are your favorite hobbies? And then a little bit more difficult might be, what did you do last weekend? And then sort of maybe question 6 could be, if you were a billionaire, how would you spend your money? So you can see that the kind of conceptual and linguistic difficulty is increasing with each question. And basically the assessment consists of asking these questions to the students. And if there comes a point, which there probably will, where they're really struggling to answer, then that's their grade. So if they answer the first 5 questions, but then they flunk question number 6, they get a 5. So that's a kind of shortcut to a kind of assessment which requires less of a formal marking scheme. So that's a sort of conversation ladder, it's called.
I think that sounds like a fantastic idea, just to do a kind of a quick assessment in the classroom. You don't really need a mark scheme really either. You're just kind of capping it where the questions stop. I think speaking is probably one of the most stress-inducing assessments for students. And often students don't speak enough, so it's a really stressful thing for students to do. So anything that you can do in the classroom to reduce that stress, give students plenty of time to practice, is very, I mean, some people expect students just to give a presentation in the class without practice. But in real life, me and Paul have practiced today for this. We've had a couple of practice conversations. So I think it's really important you give students a chance to feel comfortable and practice and know what you're looking for.
I think that's right. And I think also speaking is a very stressful thing to do, and it's a very complex skill because it happens in real time. So, if they're writing something and they've forgotten the word, or they can sort of pause and think about it, and then, oh yeah, it's this. But speaking is, you've got so many things you've got to think about what you're going to say. You've got to try and recall the vocabulary. You're going to have to think about grammar as you're speaking, and verb and tense agreement and all sorts of things. So it's a very intense experience. So the last thing you want to be doing is throwing them, a curveball at the same time and asking them to do something they haven't done before. So, if you've been talking to them about the environment, for example, to assess that as a speaking task, if you show them a photograph and say, talk about this, if they haven't actually practiced talking about photographs, if they don't know how to say in the foreground, in the background, the photograph shows this or that, if they don't have that kind of language and they haven't practiced it, it's a rather unfair way of assessing their speaking. So I think, it's always important that when you assess people that the questions are fair and the task is fair. But I think that's doubly important with speaking because of the stress they're under in the first place, and because of how easy it is to panic, if they start thinking, I can't do this. So I would be really careful, and I would always err on the side of being too kind to them. Give them things that they can start off with, give them a couple of ideas, because that's the other thing about speaking, that as well as having to come out with the language and everything else, they're having to think, what am I going to say? Which obviously for things like reading and listening is not an issue. So there's so much going on with speaking that I think any help you can give them, they're still going to find it demanding. I wouldn't feel ever that you're making it too easy for them, because it's never easy.
Never easy. And just some ideas from the chat right now. We've got Sylvia. She says she makes the students talk about the news for 2 minutes, and that works a lot. I think talking about current events that everyone knows about in your class is bound to be a winner, because people will have opinions. And Lucy says the 1 minute talk is a great opportunity for students to show their fluency. That reminds me, it gives me a horrific flashback. I was once in a competition for a radio show where I had to speak about peas for 1 minute. I completely froze, but I hope frozen peas, yeah. But hopefully you give your students more interesting subjects to talk about. Yolanta's asking how to avoid cheating, and we've already spoken about that, Yolanta. So you'll have to check out the document we give after this session today. Now, we have had one question come through, and it's also a question that's been prepared, sent through early as well, which was from Nahid Hassan asking, how can I assess a learner at the beginner level? And we've had a question, the same question really, from Christina in Turkey, saying, I have none of my students speak English. I don't know their mother tongue. When I give them an assignment, they don't understand at all, and I have to mime. The question is how to make students understand what I'm saying, really. And Paul and I was talking about this before, and I think it's a painful experience that we've all lived through. Everybody who's taught has lived through. And I've kind of prepared 5 tips really for you in this area. And please feel free to write in the box if you've got beginner students, any ideas that you have. I would say the most important thing with beginners is to keep it simple and build confidence. Drill and repeat. Just do the same thing again and again. Just focus on vocabulary, focus on flashcards. What you really want with the beginners is to get them used to the rhythm of the language a bit, but also to build their confidence, because it's fairly terrifying speaking a new language with a group of people. Provide lots of practice time. So much practice time, too much practice time, I think, is probably the right thing to do. You could play games like bingo or matching words, any kind of games that you want to do. Mime a lot. Christina from Turkey was saying she mimes a lot. That's good. That's a good thing to do. You're going to have to mime a lot. I would say praise often. I can't say enough about positive feedback, positive reinforcement. Let your beginner students know they're doing well. And make it lively. Don't focus on the same thing for a long time. You're going to want to have lots of nice short activities and switch between those activities to get that engagement. And one thing that is super important, if you're teaching a beginner class, it's really, really important to use a well-designed course book if you can, because that's got the framework, all the thinking's gone into it, it's staged and it's scaffolded in a way that's going to help you teach your class to the best that you can. And also join Oxford Teachers Club for lots of free resources. So if somebody could put the link to Oxford Teachers Club. And Paul, I'll just hand over to you because I think you're going to say something.
Well, really, to reinforce your point about course books, one of the things that, if you're writing a course book for beginners, one of the things that's very much on your mind is how can you get the most out of them with the simplest instructions? Because it's possible to come out with these fantastic tasks which take so long to set up and explain that really it's not quite going to work. So there's always that sort of trade-off. And really the emphasis at lower levels has to be, how do you get them saying something without having too much of a sort of elaborate build-up or input, and so things like bingo and other games like that are fantastic. But really, if you use a good course book, that issue should have been sorted, and the tasks should be appropriate and simple.
And we've had a question from YouTube. Yuri Lopez asks, how can we evaluate fluency at the beginner level? I would kind of say you can't evaluate fluency at the complete beginner level. And I think this comes back to thinking about what you want to assess, Yuri. If you've got total beginners, you might have taught them a role play and some discrete items of vocabulary, colours, numbers, those basic things. It's quite difficult to assess fluency at that stage. And I think what you want to be doing maybe more is just assessing the vocabulary that they know and giving them some grades that give them a bit of confidence. Yeah. Just checking the chat box. Daniela has beginner students. Just going through. Fausto asks, how can a disabled student be assessed? And I think this, it depends really what the disability the student has. So there's nothing that stops a disabled student being assessed on the assessments from OUP, the Oxford Test of English. We have various settings for different impairments, give extra time for different impairments. So most test providers are fairly flexible, and as should you be. If you have students that are dyslexic, you're going to be wanting to make sure that you're giving them extra time to do the assessment. Often people say 25 to 30% extra time. If you have students who have physical impairments, then you need to make sure they have the right hardware that they need. But that's not my massive area of expertise, but there is a lot to say about making sure that our assessments are accessible to everybody, because that is of utmost importance, and we do put a lot of effort into making sure that our assessments are available to everybody, regardless of physical disabilities. So we've spoken a bit about beginners, and we've spoken a bit about Oxford Teachers Club, the importance of using a course book. We've given you a few ideas there. Another question that jumped out for me was about, how do you boost, this is from Susanna Fernandez, how do you boost motivation and make them switch their cameras on to assess participation? I'm not sure if you have these issues, if you're teaching online and your students don't want to put their cameras on, please let us know. Please write in the comments box how you deal with this. And welcome to Everaldo and Min from Brazil and Myanmar. I think to get students to turn their cameras on can be tricky, but you have to make it the norm. And to make it the norm, I'd say you want to have fun icebreakers. Don't make it a stressful lesson. You know, start with some fun stuff, some easy stuff. Like Paul was saying about the speaking, really, you want to start with the easy things to build that confidence. You can send students a private message to get them to turn their cameras on. What I would do is to make there be a reason for cameras on. If there's not a reason, then why would they do it? And the reason could be a show and tell. You could have a silly t-shirt day. You could have people describing a photo, or you could do charades. There's lots of different activities you could do that need the camera on. And if people, oh, Lucy, that's a lovely comment. Lucy says, I miss your smiles. I think that's a really nice comment. That's probably going to get them to turn their cameras on straight away. And then get smaller groups, get people to break out in small groups where they maybe feel a bit more comfortable. But ultimately, I'd say flip it. Instead of making camera on the weird thing, I would make camera off the thing that you do every now and then, rather than camera on the thing that you do every now and then. Letitia says, they just finished a test. The norm is cameras on, and they write down the students' names and let their parents know. There you go. That's going to get the camera on.
Yeah. I think the important thing is to set up the expectations at the start, isn't it? So if the expectation from the word go is that it's normal to have your camera on, because if we're in a classroom, it's normal to be face-to-face. So if you're at home and we're doing it via Zoom or Google Classroom or whatever, Teams, the norm is to have your camera on. Then it becomes, then they need a reason to turn it off, really. Whereas if you start off with the norm being cameras are off, then they need a reason to turn them on, and it becomes slightly more awkward. So if you can set it up so that the default position is cameras on, then that's obviously the best way to go. Yeah.
And Angeline has got an idea about seeing who can make the most funny face. I used to teach young learners that would have everybody with the camera on immediately. And Sylvia says, she says to students, I would like to know, how are you right now? Maybe you're happy or not. Maybe you're tired, so I can understand better. So really nice advice. And Sharak saying in Asian countries, it's better to let them feel comfortable to turn the camera on. And I think that's important, in making people feel comfortable and that it's a safe space. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. And there's one that I'm going to kind of flag as one that I don't think we're going to be able to answer today. I'm just looking for it. So Duk Vodui is asking, what assessment would be ideal to include presentation skills, QA sessions, and audience interactions? I don't think we're going to be able to answer that because I'm not entirely sure what you're looking for. There are lots of tests out there that include presentation skills. Most course books have something on doing a long turn. I think if you can maybe in the Facebook group try and describe a bit better what you're looking for, then we'll get back to you. But maybe one of the final questions we can look at, because we've had a few come through on this, is how can we assess virtual teamwork? Is this an issue for a lot of people? Are you struggling to get teamwork assessed? I know we want our students to work in groups because we all know students learn better from each other than from the teacher often. And the three things I would say there is it's difficult because it's going to be time consuming. I think you could just assess the group work, but then you're going to have people who maybe resented that. So I think you're going to have to assess the individual and the team. I think you're going to have to assess the process and the product because you want to know the process the students have gone through as well as the what.
Yeah.
And you're going to need those clear assessment criteria that we've spoken about again, because that's really, really important. Anything to add, Paul, on assessing virtual teamwork?
Well, I think you're right. You do need to assess the processes as well. I think project work is something which you can, where you can include an element of self-assessment. So one idea, for example, is at the start of the project, you get the group to say what their goal is, and then maybe some subsidiary objectives below that. And then at the end of the project, they have to assess how well they've met their overall goal. You could have a marking scheme. They could choose to give themselves 60 marks, 40 marks, or 20 marks, for example, for the main goal. And then for the objectives below that, which they come up with. So, for example, one of their objectives might be to get the script written within 2 weeks or whatever, to involve everybody in the filming, or they decide on their objectives. They then give themselves a mark for each objective, but that would be a smaller mark because they're secondary objectives. So they might give themselves 6, 4, or 10, 8, or 6, or something out of 10. So that's a sort of form of self-assessment, which is really just another element to your overall assessment. But it's good to get them to think about those things as part of the process.
Definitely, and teamwork is great, and the how we've talked a bit about what you should be assessing. But there's also the technology, and I think this is a thing that you can easily do if you are assessing online. You can easily use breakout rooms in Teams, and you can get your students to work together on projects or problems that you've got for them to solve. So there's lots to be done in teamwork, and I think it's the same as self-assessment really. A bit of time to set up, but once you've set it up, it's repeatable. You've got the same almost assessment criteria every time. You've got the same process to follow, and the more repeatable things are, the easier it is for students to show off their best language because they're not focused on what they're trying to do because they already know what the process is. So I think we're just about to end this. It's been a fantastic 46 minutes speaking to you. I'll just hand over to Paul to see if you've got any final comments, Paul.
Well, I think my only final comment, as someone who writes quite a lot of tests, I'm slightly conscious of the fact that often when we test the students, we're trying to catch them out. So we're trying to we tend to home in on those little exceptions, that verb which you don't use in the middle of a present continuous exercise. We'll stick in one of those verbs that isn't used in continuous tenses just to see if we can trip them up. And that can be frustrating. It's a little bit unfair, but it's sort of in the nature of test writing. But I just want to share with you an idea for really at the other end of the spectrum. So rather than trying to trip the students up, add in a little thing at the end, which allows them to show off what they do know, which they may not have been asked about in the test, because it's very frustrating if students revise for things and it doesn't crop up. So if I can just ask Kat to share the screen. Here's an example of something you could do. So this is everything I know that wasn't in the test. So really just an opportunity for them to not feel frustrated by the fact that the questions that they were expecting or hoping for didn't show up. I'm not sure exactly how much importance you'd attach to this in terms of marks, but I think it's a good idea anyway.
I think it's a fantastic idea. It's really nice because, there's nothing more frustrating than preparing for a test and not getting that question that you wanted.
I must add that this was on a Facebook page. The teacher was called Julie Arsenault, but she got it from somewhere else. I don't know where it originates, and I hate not being able to attribute it to anyone. But there you go.
Thank you. And I think my kind of parting thoughts would be along the same lines of Paul's, really, about giving, and the same as some of the people in the box. Let's give people the opportunities to show what they know, not what they don't know, and let's give people really, really high quality feedback to drive learning forwards. And we've got some excellent position papers at OUP on assessment for learning and the power of effective feedback. So be sure to check those out and use those in your teaching practice. But for now, it's been fantastic speaking to everyone. Keep commenting in Facebook. Remember to download our expert advice on assessing online learning and effective feedback there. And yeah, remember to like and subscribe, and let us know any other topics that you're interested in talking to us about. Thanks everyone for your time today. We've really appreciated your engagement. Thanks for being so open with us, and I'm sure we'll catch up with you soon. Bye.
Bye.